The water stopped on a Tuesday in the second week of June, and Vashai was standing in the ditch when it happened. She had been in it since before light, up to her knees, clearing the winter's silt out of the last 40 yards with a shovel her husband had bought in 1884 and a wooden scraper her grandfather had made, and she was working in that half-attentive way a person works at a thing they have done 10,000 times, thinking about something else entirely. About whether the girl's shoes would last another season, when she noticed that the sound had changed. Water in a ditch has a sound. It is not loud. It is a low, continuous conversation that a person who grew up beside it stops hearing in the same way they stop hearing their own breathing, and it changes when the volume changes, and every woman in that village could have told you within an hour of when the flow dropped, by ear, from 400 yards away, in her sleep. Vashai straightened up with the shovel in her hands. The water at her knees was going down, not fast. It was simply, quietly leaving, the way it does when something upstream has been shut, and the last of what is already in the channel runs on ahead and does not get replaced. She stood there and watched it go past her shins, and then past her ankles, and then it was a brown skin of water half an inch deep moving over the mud, and then the mud began to shine and then to dull, and it took perhaps 11 minutes altogether. At the end of the 11 minutes, she was standing in a dry ditch in the bottom of a country that had grown wheat for 2,000 years. She did not shout, she did not run. What she did was to lay the shovel on the bank and climb out and sit down on the edge with her feet in the drying mud and work out what it meant in order, the way she did everything. It meant the wheat was gone, not damaged, gone. It was the second week of June, the heads were filling, and wheat that far along needs water within 9 or 10 days, or it makes nothing at all, and there was no other water. It meant the beans that had just come up in the low field were gone in about 5 days. It meant that the 11 acres she and her sister-in-law had put in together, which had cost them the whole of the spring, had produced exactly nothing, and that the seed they had held back to plant it had been eaten by the ground. It meant that in this year, 1891, in the month of the saguaro harvest, her household had food for perhaps 5 weeks. And it meant, and this was the part she sat with the longest, with her feet in the mud and the heat coming up, that it had not happened by itself. The river had gone down before. Rivers do. Every person along that water knew the difference between a dry year and a shut gate, and knew it the way they knew the difference between a person being asleep and being dead. And there had been no flood, no washout, no break in the bank, and it was the second week of June, and 42 miles upstream there was a canal company that had been digging since 1886. She sat there a while longer. Then she got up, because the shovel would rust if she left it in the wet, and there was work. Here is what has to be understood about those people, and if it is not understood, then nothing that follows makes any sense at all. And most people who hear this story hear it wrong from the first sentence, because they have a picture in their heads of who the desert people were, and the picture is wrong. They were farmers. Not in the way that a hunting people sometimes puts a little corn in the ground. They were farmers the way the Nile was farmers. They had been irrigating that valley since before Rome, in canals dug by hand, some of them 30 feet wide and running for 16 miles, laid out on grades so exact that men with instruments came out in the 1880s and measured them and went away quiet. Wheat, corn, beans, squash, melons, cotton, 2 crops a year in the good years, and they had been rich. That is the piece nobody says. In the 1850s and 1860s, these people were the granary of the whole territory. When the emigrant trains came through starving, and thousands did, it was these villages that fed them, sold them wheat, sold them melons, and did not rob them, which is a matter of record and was remarked on with astonishment at the time. When the army came out to fight in that country, it was these villages that fed the army. In 1870, they sold 3 million pounds of wheat in a single season. They had been, in the plainest terms, a prosperous, settled, agricultural, law-abiding people who had never in their history made war on the United States and who had, in fact, fought on its side. And then the settlers came up the valley and dug their canals upstream and took the water out of the river above the villages, and the villages went dry. That is the whole story. There is no battle in it. There is no massacre in it, no dramatic betrayal, no treaty signed in bad faith and torn up. There is a set of men with shovels and a legal doctrine 42 miles upstream, doing something that was entirely lawful under the laws of the territory of Arizona, and a valley of farmers downstream who watched the water in their ditches go down a little more each year for 6 years, and then, one Tuesday in June, stop. The people of the valley called the time that followed the years of famine. They were not being poetic. Vashai walked back up to the village with the shovel over her shoulder and the sun coming up hard, and she was 34 years old, and she had been a widow for 5 years. Her husband had been called Juan Antonio, in the way of those villages by then, a mission name over an older one, and he had died in the fever season of 1886, in 4 days, along with 9 other people. He had been a decent, slow, patient man who was better with a shovel than with words, and who had laughed at almost everything, and he had left her the house, 2 ditch shares, a wagon with a cracked axle, and 2 children. The girl was 11 and was called Rosa and was clever in a way that worried her mother. The boy was 6 and was called Miguel and had been sick twice that spring. There was also her husband's mother, who was 69 and mostly blind, and who still, every single morning, ground wheat for 2 hours with a stone she had brought into that house as a bride, and who would have gone on doing it if she had been on fire. That was the household. 4 people, one of whom worked, in a country where the water had just stopped. She put the shovel against the wall of the house and stood in the ramada in the shade for a moment. Her sister-in-law came out. "It went," said Vashai. That was all she said, and it was enough. The other woman put her hand up over her mouth and stood there for a long moment, and then took it down and said, in a completely ordinary voice, "How long for the beans?" 5 days, perhaps 6. Then we should pull the small ones tomorrow and eat them. And that was the entire conversation, and it is worth saying that this was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was 2 women who had between them 7 children and no men, standing in the shade at 7 in the morning at the exact moment their year's food ceased to exist, going immediately to the question of what could still be salvaged, because grief costs a day, and a day was not available. By noon the whole village knew, and by evening they knew that it was every ditch and not just theirs, and the men went up to the head of the main canal in the afternoon to look, which was 14 miles, and came back the next day and reported what everybody had already worked out. There was no water in the river, not low water, no water. A bed of dry sand 200 yards wide with cottonwoods dying along the edge of it, and 42 miles upstream a wooden headgate the size of a barn door standing open and a canal running full and green fields on both sides of it, and men in that country who had been there 4 years and who had, under the law of the territory, a perfectly valid and legally recorded prior right to every drop of it. The meeting was held that night in the open ground by the old church, and about 300 people came, and it went on for 5 hours. Vashai sat with the women on the east side with her back straight and listened to all 5 hours of it. The old headman, who was called Kisto and who was 66 and who had been the keeper of the main canal for 19 years, said the thing that was true and that nobody wanted, that the water was not coming back this season, and that the question in front of them was not the water but the winter. A man of about 40 stood up and said that they should go up there with 100 men and shovels and open the river back into its bed, and that the law had nothing to say to them because the water had been theirs for 1,000 years. And another man, older, who had been at the agency school and could read, stood up and said slowly that he had asked about this in Florence, and that under the law of the territory, the water belonged to whoever had first put it to beneficial use, and filed a notice at the courthouse, and that no village on this river had ever filed a notice at any courthouse, because no village on this river had ever heard of a courthouse when it dug its canals. "We have used it for 1,000 years," said the first man. Yes, said the man who could read. And they have used it for 4, and they wrote it down. There was a silence in that meeting after he said it that Vashai remembered for the rest of her life. It was not a stunned silence. It was worse. It was the silence of 300 people who had all individually over the last 6 years worked out approximately that, and who had never heard it said out loud in one sentence before. Then a young man named Feliciano, who was 20 and who was her husband's brother's son, stood up in the back and said, "Then I will go and break their gate." And 4 or 5 other young men made a sound of agreement, and old Kisto said, without raising his voice at all, "Sit down." And the young man sat down, and every single person in that meeting understood that he had sat down for tonight only. The agent came out 11 days later, which was fast for him. He was a thin, harassed, not stupid man named Bidwell who had been in the post 2 years and who was responsible for about 4,000 people. And he stood on the step of the agency building and told them the following things, in order, through an interpreter, that he had written to Washington about the water, that he had written twice, that he had been instructed to encourage the Indians to farm, that there would be a distribution of flour in August of an amount he named, which the interpreter translated and which produced a noise from the crowd that was not quite laughter, and that any man who went upstream and interfered with the works of the canal company would be arrested by the county authorities and would not be helped by him, and that he wished them to understand that he was saying this for their protection. Then he went inside, out of the heat. Vashai stood in that crowd and did the arithmetic on the flour, which she was able to do quickly because she had been doing arithmetic on flour her whole life, and worked out that the distribution the agent had named would feed her household for 19 days. The winter was 5 months. She went home and did the thing she always did when a thing was too large, which was to sit down in the dark on the packed floor of her house with her back against the wall and go through it item by item, out loud, quietly, in a very low voice, until it was small enough to be worked on. "Wheat in the house," she said, 2 sacks and part of a third. If we eat as we eat now, 6 weeks. If we eat as we will eat, 10. Beans, 1 sack, and whatever we pull tomorrow, which is nothing. The saguaro harvest is in 3 weeks and will be good because the saguaro does not care about the river. Syrup and seed, that is real. Call it a month of something. Mesquite beans in July, and the mesquite does not care about the river either because its root goes down 40 feet and there is a great deal of mesquite and we can pound flour from it and it will keep. That is the difference between hunger and starving. The agent's flour in August, 19 days. There are the 2 ditch shares, and they are worth nothing at all now, and I would not get $1 for both of them. There is the wagon with the cracked axle. There are $11 in the tin. She stopped there for a while. There is the girl, she said at last, and there is a school at Phoenix where they take them and feed them and cut their hair, and every woman in this village is going to be thinking about that by December, and I am thinking about it in June, and I will not do it. Her mother-in-law's voice came out of the dark from the other side of the room, perfectly clear. "Then you will need money," the old woman said. Vashai had not known she was awake. "Yes," she said. "Not food, money. Food runs out and then you are where you started. You have thought all night about food." There was the small, dry sound of the old woman shifting on her mat. "Where is there money in this valley?" And Vashai sat in the dark with her back against the wall of her husband's house, and said the thing that had been standing at the back of the room since the water stopped, and that she had been walking around for 2 weeks. "Wood," she said. "Yes. They burn it in the town. They burn it in the mills and the hotels and the brickyards and every kitchen in Phoenix, and there is no wood in Phoenix, and there is mesquite standing on this land for 20 miles. Her voice was flat. "They pay $1.50 a cord at the wood yard. I have heard $2. It is 40 miles. 41. "And you have a wagon with a cracked axle and no mules," said her husband's mother. "Yes." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "There is 1 man in this valley with 2 wagons and 8 mules," she said. "I know it. And nobody will ride with him. I know that too, said Vashai. The old woman lay back down. Then you had better go early, she said, before it is hot, and you had better wear your shoes, because he will look at your feet before he looks at your face. That is the kind of man he is. And Vashai sat in the dark for a long time after that, listening to her children breathe, and to the total, complete, unbroken silence outside where for her entire life there had been the sound of water in a ditch. Ignacio Rios lived 4 miles east of the village on a piece of high ground above the old channel, and he lived there for a reason, and the reason was that nobody had put him there and nobody could make him leave. Vashai walked it in the dark and got there at first light, and she wore her shoes. The place told her a good deal before she saw the man. There was a brush corral with 8 mules in it, all of them in flesh, all of them shod, which in that valley in that year was an extraordinary thing to see. There were 2 wagons, a big freight wagon with iron tires and a lighter one, both of them backed under a ramada out of the sun with the tongues up off the ground so the wood would not check. There was a workbench. There was a barrel of water with a lid on it. There was a heap of scrap iron sorted into 3 piles by size. It was the establishment of a man who intended to be able to move 50 tons of anything anywhere, and who had no one to help him do it. "You are standing in the road," said a voice. He was under the freight wagon on his back with a wrench, and had been the whole time. "I am," said Vashai. "Then either come in or go on, but do not stand in the road looking at a man's mules at daylight, because there is only one reason people do that." He came out from under the wagon. Ignacio Rios was 41 years old. He was not a large man. He had a Mexican father and an Oaxaca mother, and a face that had been out in that sun for 4 decades, and there was a scar that came out of his hairline and stopped at the eyebrow, and he had the specific, unhurried, sideways way of looking at a person that Vashai had only ever seen in 2 other men, both of whom had been Army Scouts. He had, in fact, been an Army Scout. That was one of the 3 things everybody in that valley knew about him. The second was that he had money, or something like it. Wagons, mules, contracts, a way of coming back from Tucson with things. The third was Ramon Ochoa. "You are Juan Antonio's widow," he said. "Yes, he was a good man. He sold me a plow point in 1885 and would not take what it was worth." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You have walked 4 miles before the sun. Say it standing up. I do not have anywhere to sit that is not the ground." And Vashai, who had spent the whole 4 miles building an approach with 3 stages in it, looked at the man's face and threw all of it away, exactly as a woman in another country in another decade had done in another man's lodge, for exactly the same reason, because there was no percentage in being clever at somebody who was going to see it. "The water is gone," she said. "The wheat is gone. There will be no crop this year, and there will be no crop next year unless something changes upstream, and nothing is going to change upstream. There are 4 people in my house and $11 in a tin. I am going to cut mesquite and haul it to Phoenix and sell it at the wood yards, and I do not have a wagon or a mule or any way at all of getting it there, and you have 2 wagons and 8 mules and no one who will work with you." Ignacio Rios stood there with the rag in his hand. "You want to hire a wagon?" "No," said Vashai. "I have no money to hire a wagon, and you would be a fool to rent one to a woman with $11. I want a partnership, half and half. You put in the wagons and the mules and the feed. I put in the labor and the cutting and the loading, and I bring my sister-in-law and 2 boys of 14, and I do the selling in the town." "Why would I want you to do the selling?" "Because I have been in that town 9 times and you have been in it 100, and in all 100 of those times they saw you coming from the far end of the street," said Vashai. "You are a man who was a scout. Every freighter in the valley knows your face, and half of them hate you and the other half are afraid of you, and neither of those things gets $1.75 out of a wood yard. A woman with 2 children on the seat gets $1.75 because the man at the yard wants to feel like a decent fellow for 4 minutes, and it costs him $0.25, and he will tell his wife about it at supper." There was a silence. "That is a very ugly thing to say about yourself," said Ignacio Rios. "Yes," said Vashai. "I am going to be doing it twice a week until March, so I have thought about it." And he laughed. Once. Short, entirely without pleasure. The way a man laughs who has been alone long enough that the sound has gone rusty. He put her to work before he answered. That was the first thing she learned about him, and she came to understand later that it was not rudeness and not a test in the ordinary sense. It was simply that this was a man who did not believe one word anybody said, and never had, and who evaluated human beings exclusively by watching them handle objects. "Take that end," he said, and they spent 40 minutes getting a wheel off the light wagon, and she was strong and she was accurate, and she did not talk while she worked, and she did not let go of a thing before she had told him she was letting go of it. When it was done, he sat down on the wheel hub and looked at her for a while. "Now I will tell you why nobody works with me," he said, "because in about 9 days somebody in the village will tell you, and they will tell it wrong, and then you will be carrying 2 things at once. So I am going to tell it, and it is not a pleasant story, and I am not going to soften it. Say it. In 1884, I was a scout for the army out of San Carlos," he said. "Everybody knows that part. What they do not say out loud in front of me is that in November of that year, I was with a column that came onto a rancheria in the mountains, and it was not a war camp, and there were 19 people in it, and 11 of them were women and children, and I had told the lieutenant the day before that it was not a war camp, and I told him again that morning, and he did what he did." He was looking at the ground. "I did not fire that morning. That is the truth, and it is worth nothing, because I had cut the trail, and I had read it correctly, and I had brought 40 men to the mouth of that canyon, and a man who does that does not get to stand at the back and say he did not fire." He turned the wrench over in his hands. "I drew my pay for 9 more months. I want that said too. I did not resign in disgust the following morning. I went on scouting until the money was enough for the wagons, and then I quit, and I have never told anybody why, and now I have told you." Vashai stood there in the early sun. "And Ramon Ochoa," she said. "Ah," said Ignacio Rios, "you do not waste time either." "No. Ramon Ochoa was a freighter out of Florence, and he was drunk, and he came at me at the Zacaton crossing in 1888 with a knife in front of 6 people, over a load I had taken off him honestly by bidding under him." He said it in the same flat voice. "I broke his arm, and he went into the water, and he drowned in 11 inches of water because he was drunk and could not get his face out of it, and I was standing on the bank when he did it, and I did not go in." "Why not?" "Because he had a knife in the other hand," said Ignacio Rios, "and because I did not want to. Both of those are true, and I have never been able to work out which one was on top, and I have had 3 years to sit here and think about it." He looked up at her. "The justice at Florence held an inquest and said it was an accident in the course of an affray and let me go in one afternoon," he said. "So there is your man. A scout who brought soldiers onto a camp of women, and a man who watched somebody drown. Both of those are things I actually did. There is no version where you find out later that it was all a misunderstanding and I was a good fellow the whole time." Vashai considered it. She considered it for a long time, standing in the sun, and she was aware that the entire rest of her life was very probably being decided in that minute, and she took the minute. "I do not care," she said. "You should." "I did not say I do not think it matters. I said I do not care, and I want to be exact with you because I am going to be on a wagon seat next to you for 11 hours at a time." She folded her arms. "My son is 6 years old, and he was sick twice this spring, and if he is hungry in February, he will get sick a 3rd time, and that will be the end of it. That is the whole of what is in my head. There is no room in it this year for the question of what kind of man you are. That is a cold thing." "Yes," said Vashai. "June was warmer. Ask me again in 5 years, and you may get a different answer, and it might even be a worse one." And Ignacio Rios looked at her for a long moment, and then stood up off the wheel hub. "Half and half," he said, "with 3 conditions. Say them. The mules eat first, before you, before me, before your children. If it ever comes to it, and in a bad winter it comes to it, the grain goes into the mules, because 8 mules is the only thing standing between this valley and the school at Phoenix, and a woman who cannot say yes to that today will cry about it in January, and I will not have it." "Agreed." "Second, you do not touch the money in the town." Not because I think you would steal it, you would not, you are the kind who counts twice, but because the day one woodyard man says a squaw handled his cash box wrong, we are finished in that town forever, and so is every other family in this valley who tries it after us. You sell. I take the money in my hand in front of him. You count it in the wagon on the road out, and if it is short by a nickel, we go back. Vashai's jaw tightened, and she made herself think about it for 4 full seconds before she answered. Agreed, she said. And I hate it. Good. Hate it. Third, said Vashai, is mine. He stopped. You will not put a hand on me, and you will not ask, and you will not do the thing that is worse than asking, which is to be very careful and very good for 8 months so that when you finally do ask, I owe you. She held his eyes. If it ever changes, it will change because I say a sentence out loud, not because you have been patient. Ignacio Rios put the wrench down on the wheel hub. I was going to say that the third was that you tell your village yourself, he said. Today, before we load anything, because if they hear it from someone else, then it is a scandal, and if they hear it from you standing in the middle of them, it is a business. Oh, said Vashai. But we will have yours as well, he said, and I will say the thing to it that a man is supposed to say, and then we will neither of us mention it again, because I am 41 years old and I would rather be understood once than reassured every month. He picked up the wrench. Agreed. She told the village that evening, in the open, standing up, which is a thing that women in that place did not particularly do, and she did it anyway. It did not go well. A woman she had known her whole life asked in the loud, pleasant voice people use for cruelty in public whether Juan Antonio's mother had been consulted about the arrangement, and the old blind woman, who had been brought out and set on a chair for exactly this reason because Vashai had planned it, said she was. I told her to wear her shoes, and there was a certain amount of laughter, and the question died there. A man asked what would be done with the money. It will be mine, said Vashai, and my children's, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I will tell any family in this village exactly what the yards pay, and which of them cheats, and where the water is on that road, and what the toll is at the ferry, and I will tell it for nothing to anybody who asks, forever. There is enough mesquite on this land for 40 wagons, and there is only one of me. Old Kisto said nothing during any of it. He came to her house afterward in the dark and sat down, and she gave him water because there was nothing else to give anybody. I am not going to tell you not to, he said. You would go anyway, and then I would have said a foolish thing out loud, and I am too old for that. I am going to tell you 2 things instead. Say them. The first is that in 4 years there will be no mesquite, said the old man. Vashai was quiet. You know it. I can hear that you know it. A cord is a cord, and it does not grow back in your lifetime. And every family in this valley is going to do what you are about to do, because there is nothing else. And in 4 or 5 years, a person will walk from here to the mountains and not find a stick. He looked at her. They took the water, and we will burn the trees to live through it, and then we will have no water and no trees. That is what is happening. I want one person in this village to be doing it with their eyes open, and I have decided it is going to be you. And the second thing? Old Kisto set the cup down. Feliciano, he said, and Vashai closed her eyes. He has been up there twice, said the old man, to look. He went with 2 others in the night, and he came back and told his mother he had been fishing, and there are no fish because there is no river. He got up slowly, with a hand on his knee. He is your husband's brother's son, and he listens to you, and he listens to nobody else on this earth. And in about 2 months, when the flour runs out and the boy is sitting in a dry field looking at a green field 40 miles away, he is going to do something. I know, said Vashai. Then take him with you, said Kisto. On the wagons, every trip. I do not care if he is any use. Put him where he is too tired at night to think, and where there is a man beside him who has seen what happens to people who do things at night. He went to the door. And Vashai, do not tell him that is why. They cut for 9 days before they hauled anything, This is the part that gets left out of every telling, and it was most of the work. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, and it weighs in dry mesquite something over 4,000 pounds, and it does not exist in the world until somebody has made it exist with an axe. Mesquite is not a tree in the way that a person from a wet country understands trees. It is a low, black, iron-hard, spiteful thing with a crown wider than it is tall and thorns 2 inches long, and the wood in it will turn a bad axe and take the edge off a good one by noon. It burns hotter and longer than almost anything else on the continent, which is why the town wanted it, and it is hard for exactly the same reason. They went out at 3 in the morning to be cutting by 4, because by 10 the axe handle was too hot to hold, and by noon a person working in that heat was in real danger. Vashai cut with a single-bit axe with a handle her husband had made. Her sister-in-law cut. The 2 14-year-olds, her sister-in-law's boy and another, dragged and stacked and were worth about 2/3 of an adult each. Feliciano, who had come on the second day without a word being said about why, cut like a man trying to injure the ground. And Ignacio Rios worked the trimming and the loading, which sounds like the easy end and is not. On the third morning, Vashai stopped and watched him, because she had noticed something. He was loading the freight wagon with the pieces standing on end at the front and lying flat at the back, and he was putting the crooked stuff in the middle where it could not be seen, and he was doing it in a pattern. "You are building it," she said. "Of course I am building it. What did you think that you throw it in? Show me." And he stopped and looked at her for a second with something moving behind his face, and then he showed her. And it took an hour, and it was the first hour of the rest of their lives, although neither of them knew that. "A woodyard man measures with his eye, and then with a stick," he said. "He is looking at the face of the load and the top of it. So the face is your straight pieces, butts out, tight, and the top is flat and level like a table, because a load with a lumpy top looks like a cheat, and a load with a flat top looks like an honest measure even when it is exactly the same wood. That is not lying. The wood is all there either way. It is the difference between 1.75 and 1 1/4, and it takes 40 minutes. And the middle is where the crooked goes, and every woodyard man in Arizona knows the middle is where the crooked goes, and he does not care, because he does the same thing when he sells it to the hotel. He set a piece and knocked it home with his palm. Also, and this matters more, a load built like this does not shift on the Sacaton grade. A load that shifts on the Sacaton grade puts a wagon on its side with a woman under it. Half of what looks like showmanship in freighting is not. On the 5th day, she was building the light wagon herself, badly. On the 11th day, she was building it well. He never said so. What he did was to stop checking it, which she noticed on the 14th day, and which meant more. They went to town for the first time on the 2nd of July. They left at 2 in the morning with 2 wagons, the big one at 2.5 cords, the light one at 1.5, and 8 mules and 4 people, and 11 gallons of water, and a bag of pignol and one of dried melon, and Vashai sat on the seat of the light wagon with the lines in her hands and her heart going like a bird, because she had never driven 4 mules anywhere in her life and had spent the previous week learning in a field. The road was 41 miles. It took them from 2 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and here is what it consisted of, because if it is not said plainly, then the money at the other end does not mean anything. 5 miles of good going in the dark on the old road below the village. Then the sand, 9 miles of it, a wash bottom where the wheels went into the fellows and the mules had to be talked through it 100 yards at a time, and where twice they had to unhitch the light wagon's team and double it onto the big one and pull it through and then come back for the other, which cost an hour and 40 minutes each time. Then the flats at daylight, which were fast and which was where you made up your time. Then the heat. By 9 in the morning, it was over 100. By noon, it was 112, which is a number that means nothing written down and means, in the actual world, that the iron of the wagon tire will take the skin off a palm. and that a person's lips split, and that the mule's breathing changes, and that you begin to watch the animals with a specific fear because a mule that goes down in that country at noon is a mule that is going to die, along with 4,000 pounds of your capital. They stopped from 11 until 2 under a stand of cottonwood where there was a well with a windlass and a Mexican family who charged 5 cents a head for the animals and let the people drink free. Vashai got down off the wagon and her legs did not work properly for about 30 seconds, and she stood holding the wheel and made her face do nothing at all until they did. And then Phoenix. It was not much of a town in 1891, perhaps 3,000 people, but it had brick buildings, and it had a street with electric wires going down it, and it had an ice plant, and it had, everywhere, in every direction, the thing that Vashai could not stop looking at: green. Alfalfa in June green squares, orange trees in rows, lawns, actual lawns, in front of houses, being watered in the middle of the afternoon by a Chinese gardener with a hose, water going into the air in a spray where it would evaporate for no reason because it looked well. Vashai drove her wagon past that lawn at a walk, and she did not say one word, and Ignacio Rios on the wagon ahead did not look back at her, which was a kindness, and she understood that it was one. That water had been in her ditch 19 days ago. Not metaphorically, that was the same water. It had come out of the same river, 42 miles upstream of her house, through a headgate, into a canal, into a lateral, into a pipe, out of a hose, onto a lawn in front of a house belonging to a man who sold hardware. She put it away. She put it in the place where she put things, and she got down off the wagon at the Center Street wood yard with her face composed, and she sold 2.5 cords of mesquite at $1.60. It took 40 minutes, and it was worse than the road. The yard man was not cruel. That was the thing she had not been ready for. He was a heavy, sweating man of 50 in a waistcoat who called her Auntie, and who talked past her to Ignacio twice before she moved half a step to put herself back in front of him, who told her the wood was green when it was 2 years dead, and she showed him the check cracks in the butt ends, who said $1.25, and she said $1.75, and he laughed like a man being teased by a child and said $1.30, and she said in careful English, "There is no other mesquite in this yard," which was true because she had looked at his stacks before she said good morning, "and there is a brickyard on Jackson Street." He stopped laughing then and looked at her properly for the first time, and it was not a nice look, but it was the look he would have given a man. $1.60, $1.60, said Vashai, "and you take the light wagon too at the same, and we come every week Thursday." Every week until March. And the yard man looked at the 2 loads and did the arithmetic that every buyer in the world does, which is not about today, and said, "Thursday," and counted $6.40 into Ignacio Rios's hand. They camped that night on the edge of town by the canal running full, 4 feet deep, with a good current, making the exact sound that her own ditch had made on the 11th of June, and Vashai lay awake listening to it for 4 hours. At some point, Ignacio said, out of the dark, "You can move further off. There is room. I can hear it from anywhere in this town." "Yes," he said. A while later she said, $6.40, $6.40. Less $2.40 for the 4 days of cutting if we are counting labor at the going rate, which nobody does. Less the mule feed, which is real, call it 70 cents, less 5 cents a head at the well twice. His voice was completely level. Call it $3.50 of profit and split it, and it is $1.75 each for 11 days of work by 6 people. Yes, you want me to say something about that? No, said Vashai. I want you to tell me how to make it 4 loads instead of 2. And there was a pause in the dark, and then Ignacio Rios said, in a completely different voice, a working voice, awake, almost young, "Right. Now that is the correct question, and there are 5 answers, and 3 of them are bad. Sit up." and they sat by a dead fire on the edge of Phoenix from about midnight until nearly 3 in the morning and worked out a business, which was that the sand in the wash was costing them 4 hours a trip, and that there was an older road around it that added 6 miles of hard flat going and saved 2.5 hours, which nobody used because it was longer, and that they would use it. That 2 wagons with 4 mules each was wrong, and that 3 wagons, the third one being her own with the cracked axle, which he could fix in a day with a piece of wagon iron, could be run with the same 8 animals if they staged them, which meant leaving a loaded wagon at the well and coming back for it, which meant somebody sleeping out with it, that the Center Street yard was not the best price, and that the brickyards paid less per cord but took unlimited quantity and did not care about the load's face at all, and that the correct answer was to sell the pretty wood to Center Street and the crooked wood to the brickyard from the same trip. That they should be selling to the Chinese vegetable gardeners who bought in half cords for cash and who were the only buyers in that town who had never once looked at Vashai's face in a particular way, and that the whole thing turned on water and grass on the road, and that if they could get one reliable place to stop, the trip went from a 2-day thing to a 30-hour thing. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Vashai realized she had stopped being frightened of him and had stopped even a little while ago and had not noticed at the time. By the middle of August, they were running 4 cords a week. By September 6, it was not a fortune. In the whole of that autumn, Vashai's half came to something in the neighborhood of $81, which is not a large sum of money in any year, and out of it she bought 400 pounds of flour, 60 pounds of coffee for trade, a pair of shoes for Rosa and a pair for Miguel, a new axe, a wagon sheet, 12 yards of cloth, a doctor from Tempe who came out once and looked at Miguel's chest and said the word bronchitis and charged $3, and 100 pounds of barley for the mules that she paid for herself out of her own half and did not tell Ignacio about, and which he found out about in about 4 days and did not mention for 2 years. And it was not just them. That was the other thing that happened that autumn. Vashai had said in the meeting that she would tell any family what the yards paid, and she did, and by October there were 9 wagons out of that valley on the Phoenix Road, and by the following spring there were 30, and the whole valley went into the wood trade together the way a drowning man goes into anything at all that floats. Old Kisto was right about all of it. They survived that winter. Nobody in that village starved in the winter of 1891 and 1892. 4 children died of the things children died of, and 2 old people, and it was called a hard winter and not a famine winter. And the price of it was written down in a place nobody was reading, which was the mesquite bosque along the old river, going back a mile a year. The thing with Feliciano happened at the end of that first winter, in February, and it happened because of the very thing that was supposed to prevent it. He had been on the wagon since July. He had been good at it, stupidly strong, quick with the animals, better with an axe by December than anyone else in the outfit. He had also, over those 8 months, sat on a wagon seat twice a week and driven past 42 miles of other people's green fields in daylight at 4 miles an hour with nothing else to look at. He had time to memorize it. Vashai understood afterward and said so once to one person, 30 years later. We put him on that road to keep him tired. And the road was the whole argument, laid out flat for 8 months. On the night of the 19th of February, 1892, Feliciano and 2 other young men rode up the valley to the diversion works of the Consolidated Canal Company, which was not the biggest canal on that river but was the nearest one they could reach in a night, with 2 shovels, an axe, and a crowbar, intending to open the river back into its own bed. They were not fools, and it was not a raid. They knew exactly which timber to cut. They had been looking at it for a year. What they did not know was that the company had put a watchman on the works in November, because the company had also been counting the wagons on the Phoenix Road and had worked out the same arithmetic everyone else had, and that the watchman was a 26-year-old Missourian named Wilbur Tandy, who slept in a shack 40 yards from the gate with a Winchester, and who was, on that particular night, awake because he had a toothache. What happened at the headgate took less than 90 seconds, and there were 5 people there, and afterward there were 4 accounts of it, and no 2 of them agreed, and one of them was given under oath by a man who had every reason to lie and who may not have been lying at all. Here is what is not in dispute. The 3 young men were at the gate at about 1:30 in the morning. Feliciano was on the timber with the crowbar. Wilbur Tandy came out of the shack with a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other and shouted at them from about 30 feet. There was no exchange of words that anybody could reconstruct because Tandy shouted in English and the 3 of them ran, and Tandy fired once into the air. Everyone agreed about the shot into the air, and then came forward along the top of the canal bank at a run in the dark, carrying a lamp on a bank that was 11 feet high with the canal running full at the bottom of it. And he went into the water, and he did not come out. They found him at daylight 200 yards down, against a check gate with the rifle still in his hand, which is the detail that convinced most people who thought about it honestly. A man who has been struck or pushed drops what he is holding. He had a fractured skull from the rifle stock or the bank or the check gate, and water in his lungs. Feliciano came home at 4 in the morning and woke Vashai up by standing in her doorway making a sound she had never heard a person make. She got it out of him in about 20 minutes, sitting on the floor in the dark with her hand on the back of his neck like he was 6. "Did you touch him?" "No." "Feliciano, listen to me and do not decide what I want to hear. Did any of you touch that man?" "No." "He was shaking. He was behind us. He was behind us, and he was running, and the lamp went sideways, and then there was no lamp. Did you go back?" And the boy stopped shaking and went completely still, which was the worst part of the whole night. "We stood there," he said, "on the road for a little while, and we could hear it. You can hear a man in water. And Ramon's boy said, if we go back and pull him out, they will hang all 3 of us anyway, because we are 3 Indians standing over a white man at 2 in the morning with a crowbar." And he was right," said Feliciano. "He was right, Aunt. That is the thing. He was right, and we ran, and the man died, and both of those are true at the same time, and I do not know what to do with it." Vashai sat on the floor of her house in the dark and understood with total clarity that this was the same sentence she had heard 8 months earlier from a man sitting on a wheel hub, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life inside the space between those 2 things. "You're going to sit here," she said, "and you are not going to run, and you are not going to go anywhere at all. And when they come, you are going to say exactly what you told me in those words, and not one word more. And I am going to go and get the only person in this valley who knows how a white court works." "He is a scout," said Feliciano. "They will not—" "He is a man," said Vashai, "who has been in front of a white justice for a dead white man, and walked out in one afternoon, and there is nobody else on this river who has, and if you have anything to say about him, say it in 9 years when you are alive to say it." The county came on the 3rd day, a deputy sheriff named Halloran and 2 men from the canal company, and, riding a little apart because he had not been invited, the agent Bidwell, who had heard about it in Sacaton and had come out on his own horse at his own speed, which Vashai noted. The deputy was not the villain of it. That is important. He was a tired professional of about 45 who had done this 60 times and who wanted, above all things, to take 1 man back to Florence and not have a general disturbance. He arrested Feliciano at 11 in the morning in front of about 200 people, and 200 people stood there in a country that had just lost its river and did not do anything, and that stillness was not cowardice, and everyone standing in it knew exactly what it was. It was old Kisto having walked through the village at daylight saying 1 sentence to every household: "If we take him back today, we will bury 9 of them by Sunday," and every household having agreed with him and hating it. The 2 other young men were not arrested because Feliciano, asked who had been with him, said, "I was alone," which was a lie, and which everybody, including the deputy, knew was a lie, and which the deputy wrote down anyway because he had a body and a confession of presence and a name, and because 2 more arrests meant 2 more mothers in the road. Ignacio Rios stood at the back of that crowd with his arms folded and did not say a word until the wagon was out of sight. Then he said to Vashai quietly, "Territorial court at Florence. He will be arraigned inside 2 weeks." He was already walking toward the mules. They will charge murder in the first degree. He did not. I know what he did not do. It does not matter yet. He unhooked a halter. Listen to me now, because we have about 11 days, and every one of them counts. They will charge first degree because the canal company will want it, and the canal company will want it because there are 30 wagons a week on that road and 4,000 hungry people on this reservation, and every rancher between here and Mesa lay awake last night thinking about their own headgate. This is not about your nephew. Your nephew is a piece of paper they intend to nail to a fence. Then what do we do? 3 things, and you are not going to like the third, said Ignacio Rios. We get a lawyer, and it has to be a real one, and it will cost between $150 and $300. We get the facts, the actual facts, measured, written, in a form a white jury will look at, because that boy's only chance is that Tandy fell, and a jury does not believe an Indian who says he fell, but a jury will believe a diagram. And the third? He stopped and looked at her. The third is that when the moment comes, somebody is going to have to stand up in that room and be the reason it happened, he said. Not the boy, the water. And that person is going to have to be a woman with 2 children and a dead husband and a dry ditch. And she is going to have to stand up in front of 200 white people in a courthouse in Florence, Arizona, and let them look at her and answer questions from a man whose entire job is to make her look like a liar. Vashai stood in the dust of the empty road. How much of a chance does it give him? I do not know. Guess. No, said Ignacio Rios. I have watched men guess for other people about hanging. Get your shoes. The money was the first wall, and it went down faster than either of them expected, and the way it went down is the part of this story that Vashai told most often when she was old, because it was the part she was proudest of and the part nobody believed. She did not ask the village for money. She went on the following Thursday on the ordinary wood run, and she stopped at the Center Street yard and sold 2 cords, and then she said to the heavy sweating man in the waistcoat, I want to ask you something that is not about wood, and she told him, straight, 4 sentences, the boy, the gate, the watchman, the court, and then she said, I need a lawyer at Florence, and I need $150, and I do not have it. I will sell you wood at $1.30 a cord instead of $1.60 for 1 year, and I will bring you 6 cords a week instead of 4, and you advance me the $150 today. He stared at her. That is, he worked it out on the back of a shingle. That is better than $80 of discount over the year, ma'am. For $150. Yes, that is a bad bargain. It is a very bad bargain, agreed Vashai. It is also the only one I have got, and you are going to take it because you have been buying my wood for 8 months, and I have not been late once, and I have not shorted you once, and because the alternative is that you say no to me now, and I go to the brickyard on Jackson Street with all 6 cords, and you buy your mesquite out of Tempe at $2.40 for the rest of your life. There was a long silence in the woodyard. You are a hard woman, said the yard man. I have had a hard year, said Vashai. He went into the office and came out with $150 in an envelope and a piece of paper for her to make a mark on, and she read the paper first, slowly, with her finger, out loud, in English, which took 4 minutes and which she made him wait through, and then she signed it with her name, in letters, which she had learned to write in 1889 for no reason she could have explained at the time. And here is the thing that she told at the end, when she told it. On the way out, she got up on the wagon seat and looked at Ignacio Rios, and he was sitting there looking at the envelope, and his face had come completely apart for about 1.5 seconds before he got it back. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Say it. And Ignacio Rios picked up the lines and said, looking straight ahead down Center Street, I have known 4 men in my life who could have done what you just did, and 3 of them are dead, and none of the 4 could have done it in a second language. The lawyer was called Thomas Vane Pettigrew, and he was 33 years old, and he was, in the plainest terms, not a very good lawyer, and he was the 6th one they asked. The first 4 said no in various ways. The 5th said yes, and then, the following morning, said no, and did not meet Vashai's eyes when he said it, and she found out 4 months later that he did business with the canal company. Pettigrew said yes in about 11 seconds, which should have been a warning. And it partly was, and it partly was not, because the reason he said yes was that he was a Kentuckian of good family and no money who had come out west in 1889 with an enormous quantity of ambition and a small quantity of ability, and had worked out correctly that a capital case in a territorial court with a newspaper in the room was the fastest thing available to a young man who wanted to be noticed. He was vain, he was talkative, he interrupted Vashai 3 times in the first meeting, and he did the following 4 things that saved a man's life. He demanded and got a delay of the trial from April to October. He went out to the head gate himself in the heat in a linen suit and stood on the canal bank for 2 hours. He hired, for $11 of Vashai's money, a surveyor from Mesa to measure the bank, the slope, the distance from the shack door to the point where the body entered the water, and the depth and velocity of the canal, and to draw it, to scale, in ink, on a sheet of paper 30 inches wide, and he listened to Ignacio Rios. That last one was not nothing. Vashai had been braced for the lawyer to look at Ignacio's face and hear the word scout and write him off, and instead Pettigrew took one look at the notebooks and said, "Good God, man, you keep records like a quartermaster." And Ignacio said, "I was one," and that was the entire negotiation. Because the other thing about Ignacio Rios, the thing that nobody in the valley knew, because it was not a story anybody would repeat, was that he had spent 11 years around the United States Army, and the United States Army, whatever else it was, wrote everything down. He had 6 pocket notebooks in a tin box under his bed. In them, in a small, tight hand, in Spanish and English mixed, were the dates of every haul he had made since 1888, the weight and the price, the condition of the road, and, because he was a freighter and water was his life, the depth of the river at the Sacaton crossing, measured against a marked cottonwood, roughly twice a month, for 4 years. "That," said Pettigrew very slowly, holding one of the notebooks in both hands like a communion plate, "is not evidence in a murder trial. No, that is evidence in a water case. That is, my God, do you know what people would pay?" "Mr. Pettigrew," said Vashai. The lawyer came back down. "Yes, quite. October," he said. "The boy first. That summer was the worst one. It is easy to lose that in a story about a trial, to skip from February to October the way a court calendar does, and it should not be skipped because the 8 months between the arrest and the trial were the months that actually broke people, and the trial was only the part that got written down. The second year without water was worse than the first for a reason that surprised everybody, which was that in the first year a family still had last year's seed, last year's tools, last year's fat, and a certain amount of the thing that keeps people upright, which is the belief that this is an event. In the second year they understood it was a condition. By June of 1892 the mesquite within 4 miles of the village was cut out. By August, it was 6 miles, which added 2 hours to the front end of every trip and meant hauling the wood to the wagon instead of the wagon to the wood. In July, the agent's flour came, and it was less than the year before because the appropriation had been cut, and Bidwell stood on his step and read out the figure and then, and Vashai always gave him this, said in a voice that carried, "I have written 11 letters. I am going to keep writing them. I want you to know that I know this is not enough," and then went inside and shut the door, and a month later he resigned. In August, Miguel got sick for the 3rd time. It was 9 days. It started as the cough he always got and turned into the thing where a child of 7 lies on a mat breathing 48 times a minute with the muscles pulling in between his ribs, and Vashai sat on the floor beside him for 9 days and did not go on a single wood run and did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. And on the 4th day, her mother-in-law made a preparation of a plant that grew in the washes, and Vashai gave it to him. And on the 5th day, Ignacio Rios rode to Tempe and came back at 2 in the morning with a doctor who charged $8 and who said the word pneumonia, and said that there was nothing to be done except keep him warm and get water into him and wait, and who was honest enough to add, If he is going to live, he will turn on about the 9th day. He turned on the 9th day, and on the 10th day Vashai walked out of the house at daylight and got about 50 yards to the dry ditch and sat down on the bank of it and cried for 11 minutes, the only time in the whole of the years of famine that anyone saw her do it, and then washed her face in a cup of water that had been hauled 4 miles and went back and started grinding. Ignacio Rios, who had run the wood for those 9 days alone with 2 boys because there was nothing else useful he could do, was sitting on the wagon tongue when she came back past. He did not say anything about it. What he said was, "There is a thing I did not tell you about the Center Street contract, and you are going to be angry." "Say it." "The discount to $1.30, I have been making it up out of my half." He was looking at a hamestrap and not at her. "Since February. So that your half stayed at the old rate. It comes to about $31, and I am telling you now because you would have found it in the count by November, and then it would have been a betrayal instead of a stupidity." Vashai stood there. "That was my debt." "Yes." "For my sister's son." "Yes." "Then why?" And Ignacio Rios turned the hamestrap over and said the longest sentence he had said in 8 months. "Because in November of 1884, I stood at the mouth of a canyon and let something happen to people who had not done anything, and I have understood every day since then that there is no arrangement of my life that undoes it, no amount of hauling wood, no amount of $31, nothing. It does not balance. It is not a debt with a bottom." He set the strap down. "But I have also worked out that a man in that position has exactly 2 choices, and they are to sit on a hill by himself for the rest of his life being sorry, or to be useful to somebody in front of him, knowing perfectly well that it does not count for anything, and I sat on the hill for 7 years, and I am tired of it." He stood up. "That is all. Do not make it into more than it is. I am not asking for anything, and you told me not to, and I have not." "I know you have not," said Vashai. "Then we will say nothing further about the $31. "We will say a great deal about the $31, said Vashai. "In November, when there is time, and you will pay it back to yourself out of the spring hauling at 50 cents a load, and I will do the counting." And he laughed, the second time in 14 months, and it was less rusty. The trial opened at Florence on the 17th of October, 1892, in a courtroom on the 2nd floor of the Pinal County Courthouse, in front of Judge Ellison, with a jury of 12 men, of whom 4 were farmers. 2 were merchants, 1 was a saloon keeper, 1 was a stock raiser, 3 were miners, and 1 was a bookkeeper for a mercantile firm that supplied the Consolidated Canal Company, which Pettigrew did not discover until Thursday. All 12 were white. There was no possibility of anything else. The territorial jury statute required electors, and Indians in Arizona in 1892 were not electors. Vashai sat in the 2nd row on the left with her hands in her lap for 4 days. 61 people came down from the valley and sat behind her, having walked, most of them, and having slept 2 nights in the wash below the town because there was nowhere for them to stay in Florence, and the penal drill remarked on their presence in a paragraph that also used the phrase orderly and quiet in a manner deserving of comment, which Rosa read out loud to her mother 11 years later, and which made Vashai put down what she was holding. The prosecution took a day and a half, and it was, on its face, formidable. A dead man of 26 with a mother in Missouri, 3 Indians at a gate at 1:30 in the morning with a crowbar and an axe, a confession by the defendant that he had been there, that he had come to break the works, and that he had run away and left the man in the water, a fractured skull. And above all, the thing that the prosecutor, a deliberate, unshowy man named Alcott, who was much better than Pettigrew, came back to in every single hour of his case. They went there to destroy property at night, armed with tools, and a man died. Whether one of them struck him is a question you may find you cannot answer. You do not have to answer it. A man who sets a thing of that kind in motion at 1 o'clock in the morning owns everything that comes out of it. which was, as a matter of law in 1892, very nearly correct, and everyone in the room who understood law understood that Alcott had just told the jury they could hang a man without deciding whether he had touched anybody. Pettigrew's defense had three parts. The first was the surveyor's diagram, which was 30 inches wide and which he put on an easel and left there for 2 days, and which showed in ink, to scale, a canal bank 11 feet 3 inches above the water, with a crown 31 inches wide at the point of entry, a slope of 1 to 1.5, and a distance of 142 feet from the door of the watchman's shack to that point. The surveyor testified for 40 minutes and was not shaken, and said, when Pettigrew asked, that a man running along that crown in the dark, carrying a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other, was doing a thing I would not do for $50. The second part was the rifle. Pettigrew held it up. He was good at this part. It was the part of lawyering that suited him, and asked the deputy who had recovered the body whether the deceased's hand had been on it when he was found, and the deputy said yes, and Pettigrew said both hands or one, and the deputy said the right, closed on the small of the stock, and Pettigrew said, Deputy Halloran, in your experience of dead men, does a man who is struck from behind by a crowbar keep hold of his rifle? And Alcott objected, and the judge sustained it, and it did not matter in the slightest because the jury had heard the question. The third part was Vashai. She was called on the third day at about 11 in the morning, and she took the stand in a courtroom that held 211 people, and she was sworn through an interpreter and then said, in English, I can answer in English. If I do not know a word, I will use the interpreter, which produced a stir in the room that she had not anticipated and did not like. Pettigrew took her through it gently and at some length, who she was, where she lived, what her people farmed, what the canals were, how old they were, and then he said, Mrs., and stopped, because he had never in 8 months worked out what to call her, and she said, Vashai, and he said, Vashai, what is the condition of your fields today? And she said, there are no fields today. Alcott let it go. It was his one mistake in 4 days, and he made it because he was a careful man, and the answer sounded like sentiment, and sentiment does not usually hurt a prosecution. Tell the jury about the 11th of June, 1891, said Pettigrew, and Vashai turned slightly in the chair, the way she had been told to, so that she was speaking to the 12 men in the box and not to the lawyer, and she said it exactly the way she had said it to herself in the dark on the floor of her house for 16 months, item by item in order, without one adjective in the whole of it, that she had been in the ditch at 4 in the morning clearing silt, that the water had gone down past her knees and past her ankles and away, and that it had taken about 11 minutes. That the wheat was in head and needed 9 more days, that 11 acres had produced nothing, that there had been 2 sacks of wheat and part of a third in the house, and 1 sack of beans, and $11 in a tin, and 4 people, one of whom was 69 and blind, and one of whom was 6. That the flour distribution in August of that year would have fed her house for 19 days, and that the winter was 5 months. That she had gone to Ignacio Rios and asked for the loan of a wagon, and that she had cut and hauled mesquite to Phoenix, 41 miles, twice a week for 16 months, and that in the last year she had personally made $81, and that this was the reason her children were alive. That there had been no water in the Gila River at Sacaton on any day of the summer of 1891 or the summer of 1892, and that her people had been farming with that water since before there was a Spain. Then Pettigrew said, Did you know that your nephew intended to go to that headgate? No. Had he ever spoken of it? Yes. There was a movement in the room. When? In the meeting, on the night the water stopped, in front of 300 people, he stood up and said he would go and break their gate, said Vashai, and the old man told him to sit down, and he sat down. And he did not go for 8 months, and I will tell you why he did not go. And Pettigrew, who to his everlasting credit had the sense to shut up, said, Why? Because we put him on a wagon, said Vashai. Because we knew. Every person in that village knew what was going to happen to the young men, and we did the only thing we could think of, which was to work them until they could not stand up. For 8 months we drove that boy up and down that road twice a week, past the green fields at 4 miles an hour in the daylight so that he would be too tired to do a foolish thing. She looked at the jury. I am the one who put him on that road, she said. If you want somebody in this room to be responsible for that boy being at that gate, it is not the man in the chair over there. He is 21. I am 35. I made the arrangement, and I made it for exactly this reason, and it did not work. The courtroom was quiet. And the water? Said Pettigrew very quietly. The water is a separate thing, said Vashai, and I want to say it correctly because I have thought about it for 2 years and I do not want it to come out as a complaint. She put her hands flat on the rail. That young man who died was 26 years old and he was doing a job at night for wages and he had a toothache and nobody has said his name in this room in 3 days except to say what was broken in him. His name was Wilbur Tandy. He came out from Missouri. Somebody is going to have to write to his mother and tell her how it ended, and I hope they do it better than they would do it for one of mine. A man in the third row put his hand over his face. He was not our enemy, said Vashai. He was a watchman. He was standing between a hungry man and a piece of wood for $1 a day for people who live in Phoenix and who have never seen that gate. And my nephew was not his enemy either. 2 poor men met in the dark at a gate that neither of them built, and one of them fell in the water and the other one ran, and now you are being asked to hang him for it. And the men who dug the canal are not in this room, and they are not going to be in this room. And that is the whole of what I have to say. Alcott's cross-examination took 50 minutes, and it was skillful, and it was merciless, and it was, in the end, the thing that won the case, although he did not know that until Friday. He did not attack her story because he could not. What he did was attack the frame. You have told this jury a great deal about your fields, Vashai. Were your fields at the head gate on the night of February 19th? No. Was your wheat crop there? No. Was your ditch there? No. Then may I suggest that every word you have said this morning, however affecting, has precisely nothing to do with how Wilbur Tandy came to be in 11 feet of water. And Vashai said, You may suggest it. Is it true? And she took her time, 4 or 5 full seconds, which in a courtroom is an age, and then she said, No. Because if the water had been in my ditch, that boy would have been asleep in his mother's house that night with a full belly, and your watchman would be alive. She looked at him steadily. You are asking me whether the water was at the gate. Sir, the water's the only thing that was at that gate. Everything else there was a consequence. Alcott stood there for a moment. Then he said, No further questions, and sat down, and Pettigrew wrote in the margin of his notes, in a hand that shook slightly, She has done it. Ignacio Rios was called on the 4th morning, and he was on the stand for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it went badly for the first 40 minutes, and then it did not. Alcott had done his work. He got the scouting out in the first 4 questions, San Carlos, the pay, the years, and then he went straight at the Sacaton crossing and Ramon Ochoa, and there was an objection and an argument at the bench, and the judge let it in on the question of credibility. And for 9 minutes Ignacio Rios sat in a chair in front of 200 people and answered questions about a man drowning in 11 inches of water. He did not embroider it. He said the same 11 sentences he had said to Vashai on a wheel hub in the same order, in the same voice, including the part about not being able to work out which reason was on top. And the strangest thing happened, which Pettigrew, who was not an intelligent man but who was an observant one, described in a letter to his brother in Louisville that week. The prosecution set out to show the jury a dangerous half-breed, and instead showed them the only witness in 4 days who admitted a thing against himself without being made to. I watched 2 of the farmers lean forward. Alcott felt it and could not stop because stopping would have been an admission. He went on for 6 minutes past the point where he had won, and by the end the man in the chair looked like a penitent and my client looked like his ward. Then it was Pettigrew's turn, and he did the notebooks. 6 pocket notebooks entered into evidence passed to the jury. 4 years of river depths at a marked cottonwood at the Sacaton crossing, taken twice a month by a freighter for his own business reasons, years before anybody had thought of a lawsuit. 1888, 3 feet 4, 2 feet 11, 3 feet 1, 1889, 2 feet 6, 2 feet 2, 1890, 1 foot 9, 11 inches, 4 inches, 1891, June, Secco, 1892, Secco, 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 Secco. The bookkeeper on the jury, the one from the mercantile firm that supplied the canal company, asked, through the judge, whether he might see the 1890 book again. He held it for a long time. The jury went out at 3:20 on Friday the 21st of October and came back at 9:40 the next morning. Manslaughter in the second degree, 4 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Vashai did not move when it was read. 61 people behind her did not move. It was Feliciano's mother, 3 seats down, who made a sound, and Vashai reached over and took hold of her wrist and held it hard until she stopped. 4 years at Yuma was not mercy. Yuma in 1892 killed people. It was 120 degrees in the cells in July, and there were men in there who had gone blind and men who had gone mad, and everybody in that courtroom knew it. And 4 years there for a 21-year-old who had never been away from the river was a real and heavy thing. And it was not a rope. On the steps of the courthouse afterward, in the sun, Pettigrew was talking very fast to a man from the Phoenix Herald about the diagram, and Vashai stood at the bottom of the steps and waited for the deputy to bring her nephew past on the way to the wagon. She had about 11 seconds. She used them to say, 4 years is 4 years. You will be 25. I will be here, and your mother will be here, and there will be a wagon and a team with your name on it the day you come out. And I am going to say the next part once. Do not make a story out of Yuma. Do not come back a man with a story. Come back a man with a trade. And Feliciano, who was crying and who was trying not to, said, Aunt, the water is not yours, said Vashai. It is mine now. Go. He served 2 years and 7 months and was released early in May of 1895, and he came out with a trade because Yuma had a harness shop and he had asked for it on the second day. But a great deal happened in those 2 years and 7 months. The first thing was that the trial did what Alcott had been afraid of and Pettigrew had been praying for, which was that it got into the newspapers and not just the territorial ones. The Phoenix Herald ran it, and the Tucson Citizen ran a hostile version of it, and then in January of 1893, a religious weekly in Philadelphia printed 2 columns under the headline, The Starving Farmers of the Gila, and reprinted in full without comment the surveyor's diagram and a table of the river depths out of a freighter's notebook. And a woman in Boston who belonged to a society for the protection of the Indians read it and wrote to a senator. It would be a good and satisfying thing to say that this fixed it. It did not fix it. What it did was produce, in 1893, a special agent of the Indian Office who came out to the valley for 11 days and wrote a report. And the report was accurate and detailed and damning and said in terms that the Pima had been reduced from self-supporting prosperity to destitution by the diversion of their water by white settlers upstream, and that the government had a plain obligation to build a storage dam. And then the report went into a drawer in Washington, and another one was written in 1896, and another in 1901. And the dam, the Coolidge Dam on the Gila, built to store the water for the Pima villages, was completed in 1930, 39 years after Vashai stood in a ditch and listened to the sound change. She was 73 years old, and she went to look at it. The second thing that happened in those 2 years and 7 months was that the wood ran out. Old Kisto had said 4 years. It was closer to 6 because the valley was bigger than he thought. But it happened exactly the way he had said it would happen. First the 4-mile ring, then the 8, then the 12, and by 1897 a man was hauling 11 miles to reach the cutting, and by 1901 there was, along 30 miles of the old river, essentially nothing left standing that was worth an axe. They burned the bosque to live, every family, including hers, including most of all hers, because she was better at it than anybody. Vashai understood what she was doing the entire time and did it anyway. And this is the thing she was hardest on herself about at the end of her life, harder than the trial, harder than anything, and the way she put it to her granddaughter in 1923 was, "They took the water and we cut down the trees to survive not having it, and then we had neither. And people will tell you that we were made to do it. We were not made to do it. Every stick of it went onto a wagon that I built the load on. I would do it again in the same order, for the same reasons, and I want you to understand both halves of that sentence, because if you only understand one of them, you will not be any use to anybody." The third thing was the marriage, and it happened in the plainest possible way in the spring of 1894, and there was nothing in it that anybody would put in a song. They had been working together for 2 years and 10 months. In that time, he had never touched her and had never asked, and had kept that agreement so exactly that Vashai had, somewhere around the second winter, stopped being aware of it as an agreement. What changed was a wheel. They were 19 miles out on the Phoenix Road in March with 4 cords up, and the offside rear tire came loose, shrunk in the dry, which happens, and the fellows started to work. And if that wheel came apart on the grade, the wagon went over. They got it off. They got it into the water at the well and left it soaking for 3 hours to swell the wood, which is the field repair, and they sat under a cottonwood in the heat waiting for a wheel to drink. And Vashai said, without any preparation at all, "I am going to say the sentence now." Ignacio Rios went very still. "You told me in your yard," she said, looking at the wheel and not at him, "that if it ever changed, it would change because I said something out loud, and not because you had been patient. You have been patient for 34 months. I have counted. I counted on purpose because I wanted to know whether I was choosing it or being worn into it, and I have decided that 34 months is long enough that it is a choice. Vashai, let me finish because I have 3 conditions and you had 3. He shut his mouth. "The first is that you are not to be a father to Miguel. He had one. He does not remember him, and that is exactly why. You are to be the man who taught him mules, and if in 10 years he calls you something else, that will be his business and not yours." Agreed. "The second is that the outfit stays half and half, and I keep counting the money. And when we are old and there is something to leave, half of it goes to my children, and half of it goes wherever you say, and nobody in this valley is ever going to be able to say, 'I did it for the mules.'" Agreed. "The third," said Vashai, and here she did look at him, "is November of 1884. Ignacio Rios looked at the ground. "You are going to tell me the whole of it," she said, "not the 11 sentences. The whole of it, once, in daylight, with the names, if you know the names, and the number of them, and what you saw, and I am going to sit here and listen to all of it, and I am not going to say that it was not your fault, because I do not know whether it was, and neither do you. Why? Because you have carried it alone for 10 years, and it has made you into a man who lives 4 miles from everybody with his mules," said Vashai. "And because I am about to put my children in that house, and because a thing that is only ever said in 11 sentences turns into a stone, I am not going to take it off you. I am going to know what it weighs." And he told her. It took about 40 minutes, and she did not interrupt once. And when it was done, she said nothing at all for a long time. And then she said, 19. And he said, 19. And she said, "Do you know any of the names?" And he said, 2. And she said, "Say them." And he said them, and that was the first time in 10 years that either of those names had been said out loud by anybody. Then the wheel was ready, and they put it on and drove 19 miles into Phoenix and sold 4 cords at $1.55. They were married in the summer, and there was no feast because it was 1894, and there was nothing to feast with. There were about 40 people, and old Kisto, who was 69 by then and had 6 months to live, said the words, and Vashai's mother-in-law, who was 72 and completely blind, was walked out and sat on a chair in front and said in a carrying voice at the end, "He looked at her shoes first. I told her he would," which is the only joke anybody made in the whole of the years of famine that got remembered. Rosa was 14 and did not speak to him for 4 months. Then in October she asked him to teach her to drive 4 mules, and he did, and she was better at it than her mother by Christmas, and that was the end of that. They had one child together, a daughter born in 1896 called Elena, and there is a thing about that birth that Vashai told exactly once to Rosa, when Rosa herself was pregnant in 1901, and it was this, that she was 39, and it was a bad birth, and it went 2 days, and that at some point in the second night she became certain she was going to die, and that what she thought about was not her children and not God, but the 11 minutes in the ditch, the water going down past her knees, and that she lay there and thought with a kind of fury that she said afterward was probably what kept her alive. No, not with the river still theirs. "That is not a nice thing to have in your head at such a time," she said to her daughter. "No, but you asked me what carried me through it, and it was that. And I would rather tell you the truth than the thing they say in church." Feliciano came home on the 11th of May, 1895, on the train to Maricopa, and then 30 miles in a wagon, and the wagon was driven by Ignacio Rios, who had gone down to get him because Vashai had said that a man coming out of Yuma should not be met by a crowd of women crying at him in a road. They drove 30 miles and said perhaps 200 words the whole way, and the last 4 miles they did not say any. And when they came up to the village, Feliciano said, "Stop." Ignacio stopped. The young man got down and stood in the road and looked at the country for a long time, and what he was looking at was this: no mesquite. Where there had been a bosque along the old channel, thick enough that a boy could get lost in it, there was open ground and stumps and a few sticks of catclaw, 12 square miles of it gone in 4 years into the stoves of Phoenix. "They cut it," he said. "We cut it," said Ignacio Rios. Feliciano stood there. "Is there anything left at all?" "There is 11 miles out toward the mountain, and it will last 3 years, and after that this valley will have to find another way to live, and there is not one." Ignacio kept his hands on the lines. "I am telling you now, in the road, before you see your mother, because in about an hour somebody is going to say to you that everything is much better and you would work it out for yourself in a week, and then you would be a man who had been lied to on his first day." Feliciano got back up on the wagon. "My aunt sent you to say that. Your aunt sent me to fetch you. The saying is mine." He clucked to the mules. "I have been in a place where they told me things were fine. It is worse than the other thing." He had come out with a trade, as instructed, and it turned out to be the making of him and of a good many other people, because a harness maker in a valley with 300 wagons in it is not a poor man. And by 1899, Feliciano had a shop with a bench and 2 apprentices, and by 1911 he had the contract for the agency and a house with a wooden floor. He never went near a head gate again in his life. He also never said Wilbur Tandy's name out loud, not once in 54 years. And every year on the 19th of February he did not work. He would open the shop and sit in it and not work, and if a man came in he would say the harness would be ready tomorrow, and the whole village knew, and nobody ever asked him about it, and his own children did not learn why until after he was dead. In 1938, when he was 66, a young man from a university came around the valley with a notebook collecting recollections of the water, and he asked Feliciano about the famine years, and Feliciano talked for 2 hours about canals and wheat and the price of a cord of mesquite in detail, with dates, and was an excellent informant. At the end, the young man asked him whether he had ever known anyone who had gone to prison over the water, and Feliciano said, "Yes, one man. He was a fool, and he was 20, and he thought the trouble was a piece of wood." And that was the whole of the answer, and the young man wrote it down and did not know what he had. The rest of it can be told quickly, because the rest of it is 30 years long, and mostly consists of people getting up in the morning. The wood trade held until about 1901 and then died, and the valley went into the second phase of the famine years, which was worse and which almost nobody writes about, because there was no drama in it at all. Men going out to work for wages on the very canals that had taken their water at $1 a day, and women taking in washing at the agency, and families breaking up, and This is the part Vashai had seen coming in June of 1891 while sitting on a floor in the dark. Children going to the schools in numbers because the schools fed them. Rosa did not go. Miguel did not go. Elena went at 11 in 1907, and it was Vashai's own decision, and she made it with her eyes open the way she made everything. And Elena came back at 16, able to read and write and keep books and having lost most of her language, and worked in the agency office for 31 years, and was the one who found the 1893 report in a file drawer in 1934 and made a copy of it and sent it to a lawyer in Washington. Make of that what you like. Vashai did at some length for the rest of her life and never came to a settled view. Miguel, the boy who breathed 48 times a minute for 9 days in August of 1892, grew up narrow-chested and never was strong, and became, of all things, a very good farmer. On 11 acres of allotment land with a pump and a gasoline engine in 1919 and lived to be 74. The pump is worth a sentence. That is how the valley came back, in the end, in the years before the dam, not with the river, but with well pumps, hundreds of them, pulling up the water that the river was no longer putting down, which worked, and which was expensive, and which is still, 100 years later, the thing that Valley argues about. Rosa married in 1901 and had 6 children and outlived 4 of them, and died in 1969 at 89 in Phoenix, in a house with a lawn, which her mother would have had something to say about, and which Rosa was perfectly aware of every single time she watered it. Old Kisto died in the winter of 1894. 200 people came. The last thing he ever said about the water, according to 3 people who were there, was, "I was the keeper of a canal for 22 years. Write that on nothing. Just remember that the canal was there." The agent Bidwell, who resigned in 1892, went into the hardware business in Los Angeles, and in 1904 sent the agency, unsolicited, with no letter attached, a crate containing 11 dozen pencils and 40 slates for the school. Thomas Vane Pettigrew, the vain young Kentuckian, rode the trial for everything it was worth, ran for the territorial legislature in 1894 and lost, ran again in 1896 and lost, took to drink, and died of it in 1907 at 48 in a rooming house in Prescott. Vashai heard about it 11 months later. She said, "He put the diagram on the easel and left it there for 2 days, and nobody had told him to do that." And then she said, somebody should have looked after him. Alcott, the prosecutor, became a judge and in 1908 ruled in a small and technical water case in a way that surprised everybody, and there is no evidence at all that the 2 things are connected, and Vashai believed until she died that they were. Ignacio Rios died in the 2nd week of March 1917 at 67 of a heart that stopped while he was shoeing a mule, which is exactly how he would have arranged it if he had been consulted. He and Vashai had been married for 23 years. There is one story about the 2 of them that got told in that valley for about 40 years afterward, and it is not about the trial or the water. It is from around 1909, when they were both old and the outfit was down to 1 wagon and 4 mules, and Feliciano's boys did most of the hauling. A man came out from Phoenix, some kind of promoter with a plan involving a canal and shares, and he came out to talk to the old freighter because the old freighter knew the ground, and he sat in the ramada and talked for an hour and a half, and Ignacio Rios said almost nothing, and at the end the man said, expansively, the way such men do, "Well, sir, and what do you think? You know this country better than any man alive. If a fellow had the capital, what would you do with that river?" And Ignacio Rios said, "I would ask my wife," and the man laughed. And Ignacio Rios waited until he had finished laughing, which took a while, and then said in a perfectly friendly voice, "No, I am not making a joke, and you are in her house. She has been reading that river for 52 years, and I have been reading it for 40, and she is better at it than I am, and if you want the answer, you may go and stand in the kitchen and ask her for it, and she will give it to you for nothing, and you will not understand about 1/3 of it." The man went away. Vashai, who had heard the whole thing through the wall, came out afterward and said, "You have cost us a job of hauling." "Yes," said her husband. "It was $11. It was $11. he agreed, and went back to the harness he was mending, and they did not discuss it again for 8 years. And on the day of his funeral, Vashai told the story to her granddaughter in about 4 sentences and then said, "That was the whole man. There is not any more of him than that. Do not let anybody tell you later that he was complicated." She lived 13 years after him. She was, by the 1920s, the oldest person in that village and one of the last 4 people alive who had worked a full ditch, who could say, from memory, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, what the flow had been in a particular lateral in a particular spring in 1878. Men from the Indian Service came out twice with typewriters and asked her about the old canals, and she answered every question they put to her, precisely, for hours, and they were unfailingly polite to her, and both times she said the same sentence at the end, and both times they did not write it down. "You are asking me where the ditches were. Ask me where the water went." She told the story of the 11 minutes perhaps 200 times. She never once told it with an adjective in it. Her granddaughter, who heard it from the age of 5, said that it never varied by a word, and that as a child she had assumed this meant her grandmother had made it up, the way stories are made up, and that she was about 19 before she understood that it was the opposite, that the woman had said it that way, in that order, in that flat voice, since 1891, because that was the only way she had ever been able to hold it. In the autumn of 1930, they finished the dam. It is 120 miles up the Gila at a place called San Carlos, and it is an odd-looking thing, a multiple-dome dam, 3 great concrete arches on 2 towers, and when it was dedicated in March of that year there was a ceremony, and a president of the United States came out on a train and made a speech, and a humorist who was famous at the time stood up in front of the crowd and looked at the empty reservoir behind the dam, because it was a dry year and there was nothing in it, and said, "If this was my lake, I'd mow it." Everybody laughed. It was reported in the newspapers all over the country. It is the single best remembered thing about that day. Vashai was 73 years old, and she was not at the dedication because nobody asked her and because it was 120 miles. She went in October, with Miguel driving, in a Model T truck that belonged to Feliciano's harness shop, and it took 2 days, and she sat in the cab the whole way with her hands in her lap and a shawl she did not need because the boy kept saying she would be cold. They stopped above it in the afternoon, and there was water. Not much. The reservoir was low that first autumn, and it would be years before it filled properly, and it has never in the century since been full for long. But there was a sheet of it lying in a canyon that had been dry ground, going on out of sight around a bend, blue and then gray where the cloud shadow was on it, and it was, at that moment, more water than Vashai had seen in one place since 1889. Miguel got out and stood by the fender and waited for his mother to say something. She looked at it for a long time. "How much of it comes to us?" she said at last. "They say enough for 50,000 acres. Half of it to the reservation and half to the white land below." "Half? Yes. Then it is half," said Vashai, "and half of a thing is not the thing, and I am too old to pretend otherwise and too old to spit at it either." She put her hand out of the window into the wind coming off the water. "I'm going to say something, and you are going to think it is bitter, and it is not." "Say it." "It took them 39 years, she said. "I was 34. I am 73. Everybody who stood in that meeting by the church is dead except 4 of us. They did not build this for us. If they had built it for us, they would have built it in 1894 when the man came out and wrote it all down and put it in a drawer. They built it in 1930 because by then there were white farmers below us who needed the storage too, and we came along in the same bucket." She drew her hand back in. "And I am glad it is here," she said. "Both of those. Do not let anybody make me say only one of them at my funeral." On the way home, in the dark, somewhere on the road below Florence, she said one more thing about it, and Miguel remembered it because it was the only time in his life he heard his mother's voice go out from under her. She said, "Your father never saw water in a ditch again, not once. 5 years he was alive after it stopped, and I used to catch him standing out there." And then she said, "Drive on. I am all right." And he did, and she was. She died on the 4th of February 1934 at 77 in the house Juan Antonio had built, of nothing in particular, over about 9 days, with a great many people in the room. On the last day but one she was lucid in the morning, and she gave instructions, which were characteristically practical, about the wagon, which was to go to Feliciano's second boy, about $11 in a tin, which had been $11 in a tin continuously since June of 1891, and which she had never once spent and had never once explained, and about a stone. The stone was her mother-in-law's grinding stone, brought into that house as a bride in 1841, and it was to go to Elena, the daughter who had been to the school and had lost the language and worked in the agency office with a typewriter. Rosa said carefully, "Mother, Elena does not grind." "I know she does not grind." Then she can have the stone in her house in Phoenix on a shelf where the white ladies from her church will see it," said Vashai, "and one of them will ask her about it, and she will have to answer, and she has been not answering for 20 years, and I have thought about this longer than you think. Elena kept the stone. It is still in that family." The last thing. On the 9th of February, 5 days after she died, and this is the last day of the story, the water came down the lateral ditch by the old village for the first time in the new allotment rotation at about 11 in the morning on a Friday, and it was not much water, and it was late, and it was half of what it should have been, and it belonged, on paper, to a project office. Rosa was 54 years old, and she was in the house sorting her mother's things, and she heard it. She heard it the way you hear something you have been listening for your entire life without knowing you were doing it, not as a sound arriving, but as a silence ending. She went out. The ditch below the house had been dry for 43 years, and it was running, dirty, slow, full of sticks, no more than a foot of it, going along the bottom of a channel that 4 generations of her family had cleaned every March for no reason at all except that they had never quite been able to stop. Rosa stood on the bank in her mother's shoes and listened to it. The low, continuous conversation, the exact sound, not similar, the same. And after a while she got down into it, up to her ankles, in her dress, at 54 years of age, with her mother lying 4 days dead in the house behind her, and she stood there in the moving water with her eyes shut, and she said out loud, to nobody, in the language her sister had lost and her mother had died in. It came back. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the ditch and at the 11 acres beyond it that had grown nothing since the second week of June, 1891, and she did the thing that woman's daughter was always going to do, which was to reach down and start pulling the sticks out of the channel with her hands, one at a time, working upstream so that the water would run clean. It took her the rest of the afternoon. By evening the field was wet.